This morning, I want to begin with a few words I left out of the sermon last Sunday as we tried to make our peace with our brother doubting Thomas. I left them out intentionally. If you look back just a few verses from where we read this morning, you'll remember that Thomas, upon seeing this crucified Lord, cried out, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." I want to begin here this morning because I would like to attempt to clear up some of our misconceptions about the resurrection of Jesus. Somehow it seems to me we think that resurrection was an easy thing for those first disciples to come to grips with. For some reason, we assume that unlike us, they had no trouble believing the story of an empty tomb, and that immediately they embraced and understood the new realities revealed by the now risen Christ. Honestly, sometimes I'm a little baffled when I hear folks say things like these. I'm almost certain I would be a more faithful follower of Jesus if I had been there. If I had seen blind eyes opened and crippled legs walk. If I had seen with my own eyes Lazarus stumbling out of that tomb. If I had listened with my own ears as Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, then I think I would be a more faithful follower of Jesus. I'm almost certain. When I hear that declaration, I almost have to bite my lip because I want to say, then you are a far more insightful follower of Jesus than those first disciples who knew Jesus intimately and witnessed everything that he did. Frankly, those first disciples, they had seen, they had heard, they had experienced, and it didn't make much difference at all. I don't know why we think that resurrection was a slam dunk for them. And in order to do so, we have to deny almost everything the gospel writers tell us about that first Easter morning and the weeks that followed. For it seems that the gospel writers are far more honest than we are about what it takes to come to grips with a living and risen Christ. For they start out describing for us how those first disciples responded. There was shock and there was fear, there were doubts, there were disbelief, there was amazement and perplexity and confusion that seized them when they were confronted with the realities of the empty tomb and a risen Lord. The gospel writers are honest. Those first disciples were torn between believing and doubting. And guess what? After Easter, they made a serious attempt to go back living just as they did before they met Jesus of Nazareth, and that this Jesus became their crucified and risen Lord. This morning in our gospel lesson, where do we find Peter and the rest? Right where it all began, in Galilee by the sea. And surprise, surprise, they are not preaching the good news of the gospel. They are not performing miracles. They're not opening blind eyes. They're not straightening crippled legs. They are fishing, doing exactly what they did before they met Jesus. Now, this is the way I hear what John is describing. It's 3 or 4 weeks, maybe longer after that first Easter morning. And the disciples have already decided to go back to what was familiar to them, to Galilee. That was home for most of them. And to the sea, for that's where they knew how to make a living. Perhaps you didn't hear this when Gina was reading, but it appears that Simon and James and John decided to start a new fishing business. And since they had spent 3 years together with these other guys, they decided they wanted to hold as many of that group together as possible. So they recruited Thomas and Nathaniel and 2 others to be their partners. Get this. 3 or 4 weeks after resurrection, after Easter morning, 7 of the 11 remaining disciples have formed a new partnership, a new business. Simon, James, and John, where they're the brains because they know how to fish. They know how to do that best. And so the rest are just along for a new career after some time with Jesus. In fact, if you listen very carefully to the story, it sounds, if maybe, just maybe, Simon and James and John and Andrew had never really gotten rid of their boats and their nets. Peter says, I'm going fishing. And what happens next? They went out and they got into their boat. Apparently, they didn't have to borrow a boat. They didn't have to rent a boat. They didn't have to go buy a new boat. They got into their boat. Sounds to me like they went back to Galilee, got their boats and their nets out of storage, spent some days getting ready to fish again, and now the night had finally arrived to launch this new business. Now, if you pay attention to how Simon and Andrew, James and John are described in the Gospels, it's hard to tell exactly how good they really were at fishing. For they never catch anything without Jesus coming to their rescue. And here it happens again. They have fished all night. Their nets are empty. Dawn is breaking, and Jesus is watching them from the shore. He calls out to them, "Little boys, you haven't caught anything all night, have you?" And they respond with the obvious, "No." So Jesus hollers back, "Cast your nets on the right side of the boat, and you'll catch some fish, dummies." And they did exactly what he said. And suddenly the net is full and they can't haul it in. And just as suddenly it dawns on John, the last time this happened, Jesus was here. He nudges Peter and he says, I just bet you that's the Lord on the beach. Now, Peter doesn't see as well as he used to because he's the elder of the disciples. And so he squints and he says to John, I can't make out the face of that stranger, but the way he stands on the beach, he does look eerily familiar. And that voice, I think I've heard it before. And so Peter dives into the sea and he swims ashore, while the others wrestle with the boat and the net and the catch of their lives. 153 fish and not a single net broken. It's hard to imagine how satisfied they felt as they chowed down on the breakfast that Jesus had prepared for them. While we watched them this morning eat with this stranger, I would like to highlight for you what I think are some unavoidable facts about living with the resurrected Christ that you and I might ponder ourselves almost 3 weeks after Easter. Fact: after you have met the risen Christ, you can't go back to doing what you did before and living like you did before. Something has changed. The bell has rung, and you cannot unring it. You cannot undo what happened. You can't rewind the narrative and begin again. Now, maybe you and I don't think we did very much. Perhaps, tragically, we made this too simple for ourselves. We walked down the aisle, we said a little prayer, we got ourselves baptized. Maybe that's all we think we did, but folks, the risen Christ has a very different perspective on that. For this reason, you and I shouldn't be surprised when Jesus goes looking for us just like He went looking for Peter and James and John and Thomas and Nathanael and the rest. We shouldn't be surprised when Jesus comes looking for us when we just stop showing up here for a while. When we go missing in action, not engaged in any ministry or mission that we are doing together. We shouldn't be surprised when Jesus comes looking for us when we're just so fixated with everything that's going on in our world that we can't think about doing another thing. Once you've been with Jesus, you can't go back to where you once were. Fact: you just can't decide to create a gap between you and the risen Christ. That's what incarnation means. That is what we celebrated at Advent and Christmas. God has invaded our world. He's right here with us in Jesus, who is Immanuel. And that is what resurrection means. The risen Christ is no longer the Jesus walking the dusty roads of Palestine. He is now the risen Christ, and He can be wherever He chooses with as many people as He desires. Not even locked doors can keep Him away from us. He came to be with us, and when we grow a little tired of Him, we simply can't push Him away. For you see, Jesus knows us well enough that He anticipates exactly where we are going. For after all, we are very predictable people. We are not nearly as creative as we think we are. Maybe Simon Peter and the sons of Zebedee are terribly excited about this new partnership they have formed. But where are they? They are back in Galilee. They're back at the sea. They're back to dealing with leaky boats, torn nets, and nights of fishing and catching nothing. So it's not too surprising, is it? Not really surprising at all that Jesus is there waiting for them on the shore by the sea. In fact, I found myself this week wondering how many times Jesus showed up after resurrection. Because I am prone to think like Flannery O'Connor, that conversion is not a one-time thing, but it is a continuous process. we may keep, despite ourselves, turning away from God, trying to go our own way, as Isaiah says. But when we come to our senses, when we sense once again that emptiness in our guts, we turn back to God again. And it seems to me that conversion gets messier the longer that we live. Fact. To be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, you have to get over yourself. You have to get over your ambitions, over your self-indulgence, and over your selfishness. Have you ever wondered why we know exactly how many fish the disciples caught that day? 153. Well, I think I know. I think it's the catch of a lifetime. This might be their first day in this new fishing business, but they will never have another catch like this, no matter how many days and nights and years they launched that boat on the Sea in Galilee. As far as fishing goes, they are done. There's nothing left for them to prove. Which brings up an interesting question for ourselves this morning. Will you and I, will we ever know when we are done? You see, we are far too predictable. We keep doing the same things over and over. We keep trying to find meaning and purpose and joy in our living in the same places, with the same people, doing the same things. And we are still pretty much driven by those same things that pushed us out the door when we were adolescents. We think who we are and our worth is defined by how popular we are. How many people want to sign our yearbooks at the end of the school year? By how powerful we are. We're still teenagers telling anybody that will listen, you can't tell me what to do. And just like them, we're still amassing all the trinkets, all the desires, all the possessions that we lay our eyes on that it looks like we might want to have. Somewhere along the way, you would hope we would get a catch that just makes us sit down and say, enough is enough, we've done it now. And that would help us get over our self-absorbed lifestyles. I think that's exactly what Jesus is driving at by the sea. He's saying, boys, there's more to life than fishing. I've given you a catch you will never top. Get over yourselves and your little passions. This is what I think Richard Rohr is trying to help some of you understand who have been studying in Sunday school, falling upward. There are things you do in the first half of life, but there comes a time when you just quit that mess. There's something more meaningful, more significant, and more joyful to do than to keep buying houses and taking trips and buying new cars and doing whatever we feel like. There's something else that awaits us if we finally think we are done with that kind of a journey on the first half of life. It's hard to believe that they went back to fishing after being with the risen Christ. But maybe it's not that hard if they simply couldn't see the big picture. Stanley Hauerwas, who may still teach at Duke Divinity School, I don't know for certain, he reminded me this week in a little rag called The Rebel Pilgrim. That's a thought-provoking thing published by one of our own, Tom Cantwell. He reminded me, Stanley did this week, to be a Christian means you become a part of the most significant story that the world has ever heard. To be a Christian, you become a part of the most significant story the world has ever heard. And for the life of me, I can't find out why we are so intent on writing our little scripts and writing starring roles for ourselves. Fact, after resurrection, the ground of a relationship with Jesus is love. Can you imagine what might have been going through Jesus' mind when he finds that 7 of his 11 remaining disciples have gone back to fishing? Where had he gone wrong? In choosing them and teaching them and preparing them and sharing with them the vision of the kingdom, where had he gone wrong? But he's not standing on the beach throwing a temper tantrum. He doesn't begin by saying, "What in heaven's name are you guys talking about?" No, he has cooked breakfast for them, and he wants to talk to them. Get this. In the end, with Jesus, it's always personal. Always personal. As our story unfolds, we realize that there is some unfinished business between Simon and Jesus. And even after having been together for 3 solid years, it sounds like they are starting all over again. As they walk down the beach, Jesus never once calls Simon Peter, the name that he had given him. It's as if whatever transpired on that night of betrayal had erased any awareness on Jesus' part that he had once looked at Peter and declared that he was the rock upon which he would build his church. Somehow those fiery oaths of the fishermen had extinguished that understanding. Get this fact straight. Jesus is always personal. He always calls us by name. Get this fact straight. There are always things between ourselves and Jesus that can be only worked out alone, one-on-one, face-to-face. And so Simon and Jesus go off alone. Simon is going to face the same question asked in basically the same ways 3 times. Simon, do you love me? The first time Jesus turns to Simon and says, Simon, do you love me more than these? Now, New Testament scholars debate here what Jesus is talking about. Was he looking at the rest of the disciples and saying, do you love me more than you love John and Thomas and Nathaniel and Andrew, Simon? Or was Jesus looking at the boats and the nets and the sea? Was Jesus talking about this new partnership, this new fishing business that Simon had come to own? You may choose among these and many others, but personally, I think it was about the boats and the nets. I think it was about the boats and the nets because that's what Simon knew best. The sea was where he felt at home. And after everything had come down, all Simon wanted to do was to go back home and put his life back together, to find for him a new normal after that very abnormal journey with Jesus. Simon offers a very interesting reply. Remember, Jesus says, "Simon, do you love me?" Peter responds. You can't see this in the English because we don't have multiple words to express love, but in Greek there are. And so this is the way Simon responds. Jesus says, "Simon, do you love me?" And Simon says, "Jesus, you know that I am your friend. You know that I am your friend." Not quite the answer Jesus was looking for. Simon apparently deliberately chose another word to mean another type of love than the one Jesus is talking about, asking about. And Jesus simply says, "Feed my lambs." The second time he says, "Simon, do you love me?" Simon responds, "Yes, Lord, I am your devoted friend." "Well, Simon, tend my sheep." But Jesus is not satisfied, and so he asks a third time. And when he asks the third time, the Scriptures tell us that Simon was hurt. I suspect he was hurt because he didn't know what else to say. Maybe he's hurt because it has dawned on him that after his denial, there is some unfinished business with Jesus that's not going to go away. Simon now understands that you just don't move on after Jesus, living as if nothing ever happened. Simon now understands that denial is critical and changes everything, and at least you have to talk about it with Jesus. So Simon, in desperation, says, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I am your devoted, your faithful, your passionate friend." Jesus says to Simon, "Feed my sheep." There's another fact. It's hard to go one-on-one with the risen Christ. We don't like it. We don't relish that personal confrontation where Jesus asks us about what we are doing and how we are living our lives and what are the priorities that we have chosen. We would rather measure ourselves against one another. So Simon, being just like you and me, looks over his shoulder, he sees John, and he says, "What about him?" And Jesus' response is quite curt. "Simon, don't worry about John. Follow me." Now let's get this fact straight. Once you meet the risen Christ and you go with him, your life is no longer your sole possession. You no longer are writing all the rules about what you will do or won't do, where you will go or you won't go, what risks or challenges you will take or you won't take. The only real partnership you have now is with the risen Christ. And his plans may be quite different than your plans. Did you hear in this interaction, Jesus gives Simon a career change. He is going to go from fisherman to shepherd. From fisherman to shepherd. Steep learning curve. Lots of books to read. Lots of skills to learn. Lots and lots and lots of changes to make. Let's face the fact, when Jesus sets His hook in us, we might find ourselves doing new things and going to new places, thinking new thoughts, setting new priorities, and making basic changes in our lives that we thought we would never make because we thought before this moment that we had arrived at the destination where we wanted to go. And none of this may be easy for us to do. And finally, this fact. You and I have only one calling. The first and last words that Jesus spoke to Simon on this fateful walk by the sea were these: follow me. Follow me. So here we are this morning, 3 weeks after Easter. And there may be a very important question hanging in the air, a question posed by our risen Christ Himself. Do you love me? And what will our answer be? Are we prone to answer just like Simon? Lord, you know I am your friend, and I can be a very devoted and faithful friend. But I'm not going to answer that question about love. So what is our relationship with Jesus? If He's not lover, then He's friend. Is He a casual acquaintance? Is He someone in our neighborhood we wave at as we drive by? What kind of relationship is it that we are talking about? And when we talk about our relationship with Jesus Christ, why do we act as if He's far off somewhere rather than right here with us? Are we ready for some kind of change that takes us from being fishermen to shepherds? It's just not a personal journey. It's just not an excursion for our own private enjoyment. Jesus says to Simon, we are to tend lambs, feed sheep, do something for the children of God's kingdom. It's not something we do casually or with only good intentions. We take care of things on this earth for Jesus. And if you don't know where that place is for you today, out in the world, you haven't found it, and you haven't even found it here in this place, there are lots of places here in Immanuel. We're starting a new curriculum with children called Godly Play. It requires people of passion, people who love children. It requires people who will give of themselves to tell a story so children remember it and it speaks to their hearts. We have Vacation Bible School coming up, in which I hope we'll have a goal of enrolling 250 children, to invite them in this place, to teach them, to love them, to embrace them. Lisa has music camp when only 50 children can come. But they need those folks who love children and who love to sing, who will be here to guide. There's a shepherd's table every Wednesday night where you may express your love for Jesus by serving your brothers and sisters in Christ here. There's children's and student ministry that needs your help. There's places in the choir and handbells and many other places where your talents for music can be used. There are the challenges of the Stephen ministry before us, and there's the calling to follow Jesus to Quincy this summer still before us. This is not a come-and-go affair. This is not you get to be here today and then leave and forget. Simon, do you love me? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, care for my flocks. Wait a minute, Jesus. I'm just a friend. Just a friend.